Hi everyone, welcome to the Pearson Access Next 101 training. Welcome back to those of you I was just speaking with. We're going to get started in a few moments. If you can hear me and see my screen that says Pearson Access Next 101 training, if you could just type yes into the question box, that'll help me know that everyone is able to see what they need. Great. It'll also show you where the question box is. If you weren't on our last training, this is where you can put in any questions that you have as we go through today. I'll pause during breaks and take a chance to look at those and answer your questions as we go. All right. Well, welcome to Pearson Access Next 101 training. What I'm going to do today is talk through the system that is used to manage the PARCC and DC science assessments. My name is Cassie Lynett. I oversee the PARCC administration for our team, and I'm looking forward to working with those of you who are new. Those of you who are just here for a refresher, hopefully this will be a good way to dive back in after a year of not working with the system. So let's get started. All right, we'll go through an introduction to PARCC and DC science, and we'll talk a little bit about managing schools and accounts. And then what I'm going to do is actually just go into the training site in the system and show you how to explore, how to do a couple different things. You're welcome to follow along if you have multiple screens you can use, but your access and ability to do some of the things that I'm able to do in the sections of the system I'm in may be different. So if something goes wrong or you get an error code, don't worry. For now, it's probably best to just kind of follow what I'm doing. Maybe have it open on the side so you can click around a bit in the training site. If you don't have access to either site, just watch and learn, and hopefully this will give you a little context for what you'll be doing in the future. All right, introduction to PARCC and DC science. So the PARCC assessment is our assessment in DC for measuring our Common Core State Standards in English Language Arts and Math, and DC Science is measuring the Next Generation Science Standards. Both of these assessments are managed through the same system, which is called PearsonAccessNext, which we'll be talking about today, and that system feeds information into where students actually take their test, which is TestNav 8. So students use TestNav 8, and then we as administrators use the PearsonAccessNext system with our staff to manage what students can and can't do in the TestNav 8 system. All right, so school and LEA accounts. You will be set up with an account. If you haven't been already, feel free to email me and I will get you set up with one. The structure of accounts is set up through organizations. So you have OSSE, which is DC, the main organization, and within that we have lots of different LEAs. Our LEAs here have a varying number of schools associated with them. So as you can see in this slide, you may have an LEA as an organization with 3 schools. You may have 1 school, you may have 10 schools. It varies pretty widely. You'll have users, which are staff members, assigned to both the LEA level, which would probably be yourselves, and then some people who are specifically assigned to a school because they don't need to be using the system for anything other than that particular school. So when you assign roles, you will need to pay attention to whether or not you're assigning them to the LEA or to the school as your organization. And we'll look at what that looks like in the system soon. Within that, we will want to make sure that all of the information for those LEAs and schools is up to date. I did get notice from someone who was working on this recently that said they were having some trouble. Pearson is working on fixing that, so the best time to do it would probably be checking in next week. But once you go into the system, we want to make sure that we're sending things to the right address, that we have the right email information and phone numbers for the people we may need to contact within the system. So just check in on that and make sure that it's all settled up next week and that you're able to enter that information and make sure that it's all accurate. If anything needs changing, go ahead and fix it. All right, we're going to start. The slides here I will send you. They have a lot of detailed step-by-step directions. What I want to do today in the webinar version is just kind of show you what it all looks like. So I'm going to jump out of my presentation here and jump into the actual sites. So what you can see on my screen now should be the Pearson Access Next training site. It has this brown bar at the top. This is the Pearson Access Next live site, which has a blue bar at the top. This should probably be the only difference you see between these two systems in terms of their functionality and what they can do. We use the training site as an opportunity to practice because the live site has the real information and we don't want to be using that yet. So we're going to be working in the training site today, but I wanted to give you a sense of what the difference was between the two. I also wanted to point out the web page where you can find lots and lots of resources about the PARCC and DC science assessments, as well as information about Pearson Access Next. So this is dc.mypearsonsupport.com. If you click on Pearson Access Next, it'll show you how to get to the training center. Also, each year, if you're refreshing for a new year, you'll probably need to reset your password. So you can do that by going to Forgot Password and set that up. There's also a section at the top here called Technology Setup. And this is where you're going to find the Pearson Access Next user guide. So the user guide section here gives us access to that. And it's one of my favorite places to go to look for information. It's set up with a couple different locations where you can look for information. I like to go over here to Setup on the left. And what it provides you with is different processes. If you're trying to go through system basics is what we'll look at first. You're saying, oh, I want to change a password. I want to set up an organization. I want to update an account. You can also manage students and student data. That's a piece that you'll be doing a lot. And when you do this, if I click, we'll go through a few different steps here to see. We'll say create a student record. And again, it doesn't really matter what you click on, but one of the great things about this is that it has a read it section where you can read the steps. It has little pictures that you can look at that'll show you how to do the things that you want to do. And then it also sometimes has videos that'll show you how to do it. So any type of learning that works best for you in terms of this process, this website is a great resource. If you have a question or you're clicking on something and not sure why it isn't working, there may be a step that you're missing that this can provide an answer to. All right, now that we know about that support resource, let's go back into the system. We're going to start here on the home page, and if you have this open, feel free to follow along. What you'll see here on the home page over on, let me just move something on my screen here so I can see. What we'll have here on the upper right-hand corner is some information about the assessment. It says Washington, D.C., Spring, D.C. Science and PARCC. Mine says D.C. right here. I'm going to switch this over to Pearson Access Next 101 training. So I basically created a fake little LEA for myself here so I can practice with some fake names and fake information as we go through. What you'll see when you open this section will be your LEA and your school. And if you are looking for a school, or sorry, if you're looking for the LEA level, you'll see a code that just has 4 digits. And if you're looking at the school level, you'll see a code that has that 4-digit LEA with a 4-digit school code after it. So that's a clear indication that you are looking at the district or the school. Right now you can see mine just says 0000, so I'm at the LEA level, but we'll be looking at some things at the school level too. When you are at the LEA level, you can see all the schools. When you're just at one school level, you cannot see the other schools. Over here on the upper left-hand side of the screen, you have your home button. We have setup, which will be an area that we'll use a whole lot as we're planning. You're going to have different categories here of things that you can do. We'll talk about them as we kind of dive into each one. There's a testing section, which you'll use much more often when you're kind of getting ready to test and when you're actually testing. There's a report section that you won't use too much. That's mostly for OSSE, and I don't know if you have access to all the same things I do there. But the support button is really helpful because it has a section for documentation. I'm going to click on this and take a look. Feel free to do the same if you're in the system. One of the things that you'll use to set up registration and something called the personal needs profile, where you put accommodations and accessibility features, is this document called the Student Registration and PNP Field Definitions Guide. It's got lots and lots of information about that. Each of the different systems that you may be using or different processes you may be working with usually has a guide, and it also has something called the file layout, which is basically just an Excel document that's a sample of the information format that you'll need to put things in. So this is a great place to find all of those resources as you go through and you're beginning to use the system. Whenever you are wrapped up in a section here, you can just click home and it'll take you back to home base so that we can get started by looking at a few more things. I'm just going to take a look at my questions and answer any that have come up. Somebody was asking about organizations and if they're already created. Yes, they are. OSSE creates all the organizations. You don't need to worry about that. If for some reason you don't see a school that is part of your network, please let me know immediately. But they should already be in there for you. You shouldn't have to worry about organizations. The one exception to that might be if you have students who are registered to a non-public school. We do kind of a pairing where the LEA number is used and the non-public is used as the school code. So sometimes if you only have one student there, it needs to be set up by us to make sure that that student can be registered. So if there's ever a point where there's an organization that needs to exist but doesn't, I'm the person, so reach out to me and we will get you set up with that. All right, looks like that was our only question so far, and I will check in on those again later. What we're going to do now is talk about the two methods that you're going to use when you're doing any sort of action here in Pearson Access Next. The first is an import, and the other is the user interface. So a lot of times when we're doing work in the system, we're dealing with lots and lots of information, you know, hundreds of students, 50 different teachers who are users that we need to set up, lots of IEP information. You can enter all of this information one by one and put one student in at a time and one person in at a time through the user interface. And I will show you how to do those because it's great when you need to make a little update. Like, oh, I need to update this person's email address, or I need to update this student's birthday because it was put in incorrectly. That's a great place to go to make little changes. If you are making changes for lots of students or putting in lots of information, the best way to do that is through an import. I'm going to show you kind of how that works by doing an export because it's in the same location. So I'm going to go to Setup, Import Export Data. This is where you're going to go a lot when you're doing these, and it's going to give you a list of options once you dive a little deeper. But first I want to introduce you to the page we're looking at now. In each section of the system, you're going to see this select taskbar. It's going to have different options depending on where you are, but it's kind of the main location where you go to do things. Down here, you're going to see a list of files. These are actually some files of things that I uploaded and imported or exported. It keeps a record of all of them, which is great because it holds the file there if you need to go back and get it. There's also little tick boxes next to each one. When we get into looking for student records or user records, you'll see the same thing come up here with student names or user names. And you can select students as a group or individually. You can also search for them by looking for their name. So this format is going to be really common when you're using the system, but it's a little different depending on which section you're in. So this one has file names rather than student names, and the options that we have are either to import or export data or view details of files we selected. What we're going to do now is import or export data. Once you select your task, you're always going to hit the Start button. That'll take us to a new page. Once you hit the Start button, you'll get, right now we just have one, but you'll get a list of options up here in this black bar. Sometimes there's a few you can toggle between. Each page will have opportunities for you to do things. And then in this upper right-hand corner, there's a button that says Exit Task and a button that says Add Task. You can use these to kind of get out of this or add additional things that you want to do. And we'll do that a bit as we go through the process. All right, so importing and exporting data. As I mentioned, there's lots of ways to do this. So you, at my permission level at the state, I may have more on my list here than you do. I can import and export organizations. As I said, we create those for you, so they should be there. I can import and export student registration. I can import and export users, which would be the staff at my school who are working on this project. What I'm going to do right now is actually going to be a student registration export. So because I'm in my PAN 101 training LEA, this is going to take all the students who are part of that LEA and create a file for me that has their information. If I was doing an import, what this would do is ask me to upload a file. So I would select the file I'm uploading instead of selecting something to be created. But you'll do this process quite a bit, so this will become familiar. I'm going to hit Process, and when I do, it'll take me to a new page. Over on the left, it tells me what it's processing. Up here near the word Details is a little pair of blue arrows, and that's my refresh button. So I can hit that as often as I want to make sure that my file is processing. And then down below, it gives me some information about what I'm processing and gives the user email. One of the neat things about these files is whenever you're importing or exporting anything at all, it'll send you an email when it's done. So if you're doing a really big file and you have other things to do, as I'm sure you will, you can just wait for that email to pop up in your inbox when it's ready. If you're doing it more quickly, you can keep hitting this refresh button until it's ready. So since I just hit the refresh button, I now see that there were 16 records, which means there's probably a couple of students taking a couple of different tests. It created a file for me. It also says it's complete and the file's ready. Sometimes when you're using import and export, you'll get something at the top here where this says complete that says error and it turns red. It happens a whole lot. Usually calling Pearson is a great way to get information on why that went wrong. It'll also, if you scroll all the way down, it'll give you an error record and it'll have all sorts of coded sentences that say this thing doesn't match this thing, or you need to include a code for this column. It'll tell you what is wrong if there's an issue, but sometimes it's a little complicated to figure out what it means. So feel free to call Pearson if you have questions during that process. All right, I'm going to download this file. I'm going to open it up in Excel. So this is the SRP&P file, Student Registration and Personal Needs Profile. You've probably heard us say it before. What it has here at the top is it'll tell me, and let me just wrap this text so we can see what all these things mean. It'll tell me the district code, school code, it'll give me the student's number, their ID number, it'll give me their name. I made up a bunch of fake names like child for training and student sample and things like that. Birth date, some other demographic information, tells me what grade they're in. I entered students in grades 4, 8, and 10. Some of the student information about demographics is entered, some of it is not. So you can see when you download your file, if OSSE has already registered students, you should see lots of this information already filled out for you. And then you can see one of the students actually has an IEP, so there's some information about that student probably further down. So this registration piece at the beginning has all that demographic information, and as we scroll over, we keep going, we see there's a big pile here that has the session name and the test administrator, and the testing code for lots of kids was already entered. So the student's taking Algebra 1, the student's taking ELA 8 and Science 8. There's some codes here that were put in the format that OSSE requires that say this is Math, Algebra 1, with my initials, and it's a regular testing session, so it has R at the end. Lots and lots of information in this file. As I mentioned when we were looking at those documents at the beginning, there's a document that tells you what every column needs to be and how it should be filled out, so please reference that, print it out, keep it close. As we continue here, you can see that there's some other things listed that are accessibility features and accommodations. This is the personal needs profile portion. So you'll see something like answer masking, time of day, color contrast, ASL video. Some of your students will have these things. A lot of them will remain blank, but this is where you would fill out all that information for those students. If you change this and you put new information into it, what you'll do is eventually save it and then upload it into the system with that new information. And as I mentioned earlier, this is where that batch upload becomes really handy, because if you're adding all of your high school students, you can probably export a file that has a lot of this information rather than typing in every individual student and which test they're taking. That would be quite tedious. All right, I'm going to minimize this for a second and head back into the website. Let's just take a look and see if there's any questions that came up. Not yet. Okay, good. I'm going to exit the task that I'm in and go back to the main page now that we know a little bit about that upload and the file and what that process means. I'm going to go back to the home page. So as I mentioned, there's the import and export process, and then there's the user interface. As we go through a couple different things coming up, I'll show you the user interface portion, but know that that import-export of the Excel file is an option for almost everything that we're doing where we're putting information into the system. A couple other features to just mention about this home page. There's the statewide testing window is listed, some key dates, some websites that you may want to visit, as well as over on the right, the customer support information. call Pearson whenever you need them. They are open already. They don't wait till testing starts. They're here to help. And they have pretty broad hours from 7 a.m. to 7:30 p.m. You can also use the chat feature to talk to them if you'd like. All right, we're going to talk through users, which is your staff, registration, which is your students, testing sessions, which is how you kind of organize your groups, and then monitoring through the system during testing. And then we'll talk a little bit at the end about how to get support if you need help. As I mentioned, a lot of what we do will be done in the setup section. So for setup, I am going to go to users because that's where I want to start, my staff. I need to make sure my staff are set up in the system. So I made a sample user with the last name user. And as I mentioned before, you'll always have the select taskbar, a search bar, and then you'll have a list of users or students or sessions. I want to work with this user or maybe add a new one. So I'm going to select their name, and go to the select taskbar and click create edit user. Reset password is something you can certainly use. It's basically the same as someone clicking it for themselves and just saying, I forgot my password, but you're welcome to use that. We're not going to look at it in too much detail today. So I'm going to go to create edit user and click start. So this is the interface. If I want to put my users in an upload, I would use a template, which would be in that document section of users, or I would export my current users so I could kind of have that file layout the way it needed to be. I'd fill in all their information and upload it back into the system. If I just want to change something about one user, I can go in here and say, oh, this person is an LEA test coordinator, but I'm actually going to change that and make them a school test coordinator. I can make that little change here, click save, and we're good to go. You can see here when I click save, it shows me this green success bar at the top. If I did something I wasn't supposed to, it would have a red bar that said an error, and it would tell me what I needed to do. When you're creating an individual user, this might be something you do when you just add your technology coordinator or special education coordinator. You'll select your organization. I mentioned before that you'll have that 4-digit code for your LEA and an 8-digit code for your schools. I want to assign a technology coordinator to my elementary school. So I'm going to do the elementary school, technology coordinator. Their account should always be enabled. Their first name, we can do practice user. We'll give them an email, OSSE.assessment. Actually, I don't think it'll let me duplicate that, so I probably won't end up saving this, but you do need to put in an email address. And what you'll see is that the username gets duplicated. So the email becomes the username automatically. Over here on the side, you'll see the active begin date and active end date. If you want to create these and set them up for the future, you can set an active begin date that is on Friday. Maybe Friday's when my training is, and that's when I want to give people access. Just note that the day you set it as is a day that people will get an email that says, you have an account that's been created. If you don't set that date, it will just send them that email right away and say, you have an account that's been created. So just be aware of that when you're creating users. Active end date, I usually set this as one of the last days of testing or maybe a week after. So if testing ends in May, I'll put it at June 7th. At OSSE, we have control over all the accounts, so we will kind of close them out after testing is over officially, but you can set internal dates if that's helpful for you. And then you would click create. I'm going to do that just to show you that it'll probably give me an error. Oh no, it didn't. Okay. I thought it was gonna, oh, it looks like it updated the account I already had because it had the same email address. So yeah, there's tricky things that can happen. It says the user already exists, so they changed the information for the user that was already there. So that's one little message that you might get. All right, just gonna check the question box to see if there are any questions about users. Doesn't look like we have any yet. Great. All right, so that is how you can set up an individual. As I mentioned, you can do an Excel file to put in the title of the role, the LEA and school code, the name of the person, the active begin date, put all that information into the spreadsheet in the format that's needed, upload it, and then you don't have to type in all this information. I'm going to exit this task Go back to our home page. We talked about users. Let's go into registration for students. So I'm going to go to Setup. I went to users before. This time I'm going to go to students. And I am in my LEA here. So I am actually looking to see all of my students. And one way to do that is, instead of in the search bar typing in one name, I'm going to click this little arrow that says Show All Results. And this shows me the students that I have who are part of my LEA. They all have a student ID number, they have a name and a last name, and I'm going to select all of them. I go to my select taskbar, which gives me a couple different options. I'm going to select a lot of these boxes so that we can kind of see what it looks like when you're toggling between them. And then I'm going to click Start. So all those options that I just checked show up here in this black bar at the top. I start with Create Edit Students, where I could make a new student if I wanted. It's a lot like the user here in the interface. I pick the organization, I enter their 10-digit number, I put in a name for them, a birth date, and then I would just click Create once I had all of the information saved, and it would create the student, and they'd pop up over here on the left where I have my list of students that's already there. I'm going to reset because I don't need to make that student right now. If I want to change a student's information, I just select their name, and each time I do, it'll pull up that student's particular information. All right, we have a sense of Create Edit Student. Let's look at Register Students. Once a student has an account that exists, what they're going to have to do is be registered to a particular grade and a particular type of test. So this student here is in 8th grade. They have the school that they're at. There's some demographic information that's been completed for them. So this kind of is the next chunk. If you look at that big file we were looking at, the first is the student name, then we have some demographic information, then we have their testing information, and then we have their PNP. It goes pretty similarly across here. So I can now go to Manage Student Tests at the top, and that will take me to their testing information. Under each student it pulls up, you're going to see a list of different tests. I have a student here who's taking geometry, 10th grade ELA, and high school biology. Ooh, it jumps around a little because it's full of information right now. Again, I said geometry, ELA, and high school biology. The assessment was assigned, the organization is listed. This also lists the test administrator here in the middle, which is my name right now. And if I go down the list, this shows me a bunch of different things that I can add as accessibility features, accommodations. Again, this format can be helpful if you're just making a quick change, but if you have tons of information to add about students, it's much easier to do it as the personal needs profile upload as part of that SRPMP file. There's particular types of accommodations for response, for English learners, one's about timing. So definitely something to explore, but you'd likely use this to make small changes rather than to make a bunch of student test accounts. The next tab is Manage Classes. At OSSE, we don't really use these much. You can do it if you'd like, but our testing sessions tend to group our students sufficiently, so it's not a feature we often use. Manage Enrollment is an interesting one. Within your LEA, if you have a student who moves from one school to another, you can kind of uncheck a box and check a new box, and they can move that student, but it's pretty rare that you would need to make that change. We do it at OSSE a lot more when we have students moving between LEAs. All right, just going to check in on my question box. Nope. All right. I'm going to exit my task here. Go back to my home page. Now that we've looked at student registration, we're going to look at test sessions. I mentioned this in the last training, but for those of you who weren't there, the test sessions are a way to group your students and make sure that students who are testing with the same person in the same room are all part of one group, so that if I'm in charge of them, I can start their test at the same time, stop their test at the same time, and really manage what they're doing in the system. So if you have a student testing alone, they will be in a session by themselves. If you have a student group that's 3 that are testing in a small group, they would be a session. If you have students that are in a class and there's 25 of them, they would be a session. So we're going to go to testing and sessions. All right, and we go to testing sessions. I'm going to do that thing again where I want to see everything. So I go to the search bar and I say show all results. So this shows me all the test sessions I've created. Over here you see that name, which is in the code that we mentioned before, with the subject, the grade, the test administrator initials, and R. The status of all the sessions you can see here says not prepared. That's because the system is not quite ready for us to jump into those details. But there's a few things you do with a session before you test. You prepare it, you start it, and then when you're done, you stop it. And I'll show you where that button is. Preparing basically downloads the information for the students who are testing. Starting makes it accessible so you can have students actually test, and stopping closes out the session. So you could see any of those words here depending on what part of the process you're in. Schedule start date is listed, test name, number of students who are assigned to it, and the organization that it's attached to. So I'm just going to select all of these, go to my select taskbar. I'm going to create edit sessions and add remove, mark student test complete, and click start. As we've seen other times on the left, you can kind of toggle between each of the sessions, just like you would between each of the students. And then we have the user interface here where we can make changes. I don't really need to make any changes to them. It just kind of lists the information about the session name. One thing to pay attention to here is the form group type is always going to be main unless you have something where that says the proctor reads aloud. That would be where a student is having the assessment read aloud to them. And in that case, you would have human reader selected here. If you do have students with that accommodation, just know that there's kind of a piece of the system that you have to click to make that happen. And those students can't be in a session with anyone who doesn't have human reader. They should all be grouped together or individual if they're testing alone. All right, it also has the students down here at the bottom that are already part of the session. If I click on this box, it gives me all the other available students. So if I select that student and save, it'll add them to my list of assigned students who are taking this. Oh, there we go, we got the error bar already. It says that we have an error. We need to put that form group type. It was mad that I removed it. Let's try it again. All right, so it saved that change, but it didn't want to save the student. So we'll add that student in again. Click save, and hopefully it'll take this time. Success. Green bar always feels good. So now I see that there's 2 students registered for this session. All right. Adding and removing students from a session. This is just a different way to go about that process that I just did at the bottom there. You can add and remove students by unchecking the box or putting in a student name and searching for them. There's another bar at the top here that says mark student test complete and stop session. This is only something that you would do at the end of testing, so it doesn't really let us do much in there right now. But this would be if a student didn't submit their test or something needed to be kind of closed out, you could do that by marking the test complete. All right, still don't have any questions in the question box. Let's go to the next topic. All right, so we have our session set up, but one thing I wanted to show you was a view called Students in Sessions. I went to Testing, and I went to Students in Sessions. This is going to be a view that is really helpful during testing. If I'm giving a test to students who are in this testing group, ELA 4 NSR, I want to be looking at that during testing. If I am managing lots of sessions as a school test coordinator, I want all of these sessions on the side to be available so I can toggle back and forth between them. Up here at the top on the right, you can see there's a button that says Prepare Session. It's not going to let me do it right now because the system isn't quite ready, but that's the button you would click to kind of download that information for the student tests. When it's done, it'll change to say Start Session. So that same button will just say Start Session. And when all the students are done, it'll change to say Stop Session. So this is the button you're going to be clicking on. Above it is Resources. And these are really important because this is where you print your student testing tickets. It says print all tickets for this session or print selected. You can do either one. Usually it's print all. When I click on this, it's actually going to open a whole new tab for me with a student testing ticket. This is a sample of what they look like. They'll have the student name, their ID number, session, and date of birth. And then they'll have a username at the bottom and a password. This is why they're so secure. We have to keep them locked away once we print them, is because they are basically access to the student's work. And we only want the student to have that during testing time. At the top here, there's options for how to print them. You can print one per page, which is usually an easy way to make sure that they're all separate. You can also print multiple per page, which gives you like little slips that kind of become a long slip of paper. You can do a grid, or you can do a list. I recommend not using the list, or no, the list, sorry, I thought it was something else. Yes, you can use the list. It just prints a lot of them on one page. So whatever format works for you. I apologize because there's only one here. It doesn't show much of a change when we do this, but once you have lots of tickets there, you can see the difference in how the formats work and pick the one that's best for you. All right, I'm going to go back to my students and sessions. So we know how to print our tickets. We know that we prepare sessions here. I'm going to scroll down a bit so we can see what's going on at the bottom. Right now I have one student in this session. If I had 5, they would all be listed here. The student ID number is over on the left. There is sometimes the code, if you are familiar with the codes that tell you about accommodations, it might say TTS next to their name. If they're having text-to-speech, there's sometimes some codes that pop up here, so those are helpful. Student name, their username, the session, this little white dot above the session will turn green, and then it will turn red when you close the session, so there's kind of an indication there. There's 3 boxes that say ready. These are all the different units. They also have little locks on them. What'll happen up above when you start the session is that there'll be 3 units that pop up with little locks, and you can lock and unlock each unit. The reason that is there is so that when you give students access to the test, they only take the unit you want them to. So as a student, if I have access to all 3 units and you tell me to click on unit 1, I can, but I could also click on 2 or 3. If you lock units 2 and 3 and only open unit 1, that's all I can click on. So that makes sure that all students go in the right direction. As a student, once I've completed testing, this ready button will change color. When I'm in the middle of testing, it will change color. It's a good way to kind of monitor students, and you'll see a progress bar that also appears that kind of shows you how many students are finished, how many students are still working. This is kind of where your dashboard, where you're going to live during testing as the coordinator and as someone who is a test administrator. All right. That should be it for monitoring. The last thing we have is just support resources. I'm just going to check the question box if you have any additional questions about the system now that we've used it. I don't see any yet, but feel free to keep adding those. All right. I'm going to go back to our slides here. And as I mentioned, I'm going to send you this slide presentation. It has step-by-step directions for a lot of the things I did today, but I felt like it would be more helpful to actually see them. But down here at the bottom, it has some resources. All right, so support for the PearsonAccessNext system. There is the user guide, which I think I showed you earlier on. Really helpful for those screenshots, those lists, and those videos. Here's a screenshot of the screenshots and the lists and the videos. There's also the customer support line. Again, please call them, ask questions, have them take you through when you get errors and you don't know how to fix them. They're the best resource to call. And then here's a bunch of links similar to what I had in the last presentation that'll just connect you to the main site where PARCC and DC Science resources are kept, some additional information and phone numbers for people you can reach out to if you need support. Any questions? Not seeing much, so I'm hopeful that that was thorough and detailed enough for you to have a sense of how the system works. Please feel free to reach out to me directly or to my team if you do come up with questions as you're going through the system and trying to figure all of this out. We look forward to hearing from you and helping you out as we go through the process this year. We do have some additional trainings that you're welcome to sign up to attend, workshops where we actually do the SRPMP, or we actually go through test sessions together, and just kind of whoever's there, I'm happy to sit with them in a group and walk through the process. And then we have a technology coordinator webinar and some other webinars later on that are closer to testing time and more focused on what will happen during testing and after testing. Here's a list of contacts if you'd like to reach out to anyone on my team. Here's their names. As I mentioned, I'm Cassie. I oversee the PARCC assessment administration. My colleague Daniela Cozar-Roman oversees DC Science. Shannon Bell does test security. You'll see her at test security training if you haven't already. And Michael Craig works with special populations. So any accommodations or accessibility feature questions, he is a great person to talk to about those. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm just going to check one last time in the question box and see if anyone has any. I do not see any. So thank you so much for joining us. I will send out slides from the presentation to everyone who attended today and post this recording if you'd like to look back at it. As always, please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. And thank you so much for joining us today. Have a good evening.